chat. We have limited time today, so we're just going to jump into today's session. But at the end of the day, we're hoping that everyone can see how both the state blueprint for English language learner success and the state commissioner's regulation 154 are tools for us that we can use to increase the culturally responsive and sustaining practices within our school related to linguistic diversity of our students. So if you don't take anything else away from today's session, there are 3 key ideas, so just memorize this slide. Hopefully we all walk away understanding how bilingual education is a right for our students that actually has its origins within the civil rights movement across the country. We understand that in New York State, bilingualism and biliteracy are viewed as assets educationally, in the background on why. And that we all see our own role in how we can support bilingualism and biliteracy within our schools. We're also going to cover just a couple of terms to make sure that we all have common language with each other. And so we're going to discuss multilingual learners, English language learners, dual language bilingual education, and transitional bilingual education today also. And I was waiting for introductions to slow down. I'm going to throw the presentation as a PowerPoint into the chat for people to access. It'll show up in a moment. But also I'll share it at the end just so that you're able to find it within the chat box. And just since we're a new group with each other, I just wanted to establish some norms for each other. This is a session for you. This is an option. We'll share contact information at the end of the session for you to make sure you can follow up if anything needs to be more specific, give like really specific questions. But this is a session for you, and please take advantage of this time to make sure that it's something that supports you. We also want to make sure that we all know that we benefit from hearing more voices. So the more diverse voices that we can hear from each other, the more we would all learn. So take this opportunity to make sure you share your own stories, your own truth, so that we can all learn from each other. And then also through today's session, I'm going to do my best to center equity. Call me out if I'm not doing enough of it, or if you see an opportunity for us to center this conversation around how we can best support our most historically disadvantaged students. And I'll take this moment just to pause. We do want to make sure that we're honoring this, and I want to make sure it's what you need. Is there anything you would want to change in today's norms, or are there any norms that you would love to add to today's session? Feel free to drop them in the chat or raise your hand if you want to come off mute, because we have so many people joining today. We have a lot of introductions still going on. So Joel's going to put in a link in the chat to this parking lot. Click it, open it, go and interact. There's going to be, at the current moment, there's over 750 people in today's call. So we're going to have a question time at the end. And so this will be a way that we can kind of help and prioritize questions. So look for Joel's post, add any additional questions you may have that come up. So keep the page open. If a question comes to mind, click it, open it. There's also some questions in there, or as people add questions, click the like button. To help prioritize any questions that you really want to make sure are answered. That'll help us prioritize questions when we get to that time in the session. And there's also some features for you to add comments. So if you want to build on someone else's question, if you want to add a clarification, or you want to respond to someone, feel free to also use the comment. But also students who were previously ELLs and have now exited ELL status, and students who were never even English language learners within their school time, but they're heritage speakers of a world language, or they speak another language other than English. And so those, and finally, also students who are world language students who are learning another language. So using this definition, we could see how any of our students within our schools could be English language learners, any of our students could be multilingual learners, not just the English language learners. So we're clarifying here, multilingual learners is actually like a bigger, broader group of students. They're like an umbrella term. English language learners are just one group underneath that umbrella. So English language learners are defined by the state really specifically as students who come from a home where a language other than English is spoken. And they've taken an exam that has demonstrated that their English language proficiency is below commanding. Most students went flat. And that's how we really evaluate our English language proficiency. For anyone who's been around since 2014, you might remember there was a previous exam, also known as the Language Assessment Battery Revised. But that's how we really determine what specifically are English language learners. Throughout our DOE documents, you'll see that we try to refer to English language learners when it's really important. We clarify this is for ELLs, like only for those students that have English proficiency needs. But you also might see that if we say multilingual learners / English language learners, we're recognizing the assets that students are bringing to multilingual learners. Yeah, and thank you, Dominica, that the PDF isn't downloading. We'll definitely work on revising that for you and share where it's posted. So just to give us a sense from across the city really quick, of New York City's about 1 million students between kindergarten and 12th grade, there are 16% of them are identified as current English language learners. 14% are former English language learners, which specifically here we mean students who have exited within the last 2 years. So in total, then that means about outside the United States as immigrants. And so there's a pretty large proportion, about 47% of our students are English language learners but are not immigrants. And grounding ourselves in kind of who these students are and what languages they speak. This is a list of the top 10 languages spoken by English language learners. That is different than the top 10 languages that are translated because this is specific only to the English language learner students. Noting that a large portion of our English language learners are Spanish speaking, and then a significant portion of Chinese, and then we get into some of our lower incidence languages that have lower percentages of language spoken. So now we've kind of built a shared understanding of who the students we're talking about are. I want to talk about the historical context specifically of bilingual education. So the bilingual education movement has its origins within the civil rights movement, and it was really about immigrant communities advocating for themselves as a part of the racial justice that they needed. So it was led within the communities themselves advocating for their own rights. Within that movement, some pretty significant federal policies were decided both at the Supreme Court and then at Congress. The first of which is Mendez versus Westminster, which was actually lobbied by Thurgood Marshall, who later would be the lawyer who also represented Ford versus Brown of Education, and noted that the segregation of Mexican American students into a separate class was violation of the 14th Amendment, really kind of beginning the civil rights movement within education prior to Brown versus Board of Education. And specific to our bilingual education, we see that the Lau versus Nichols case in 1974 was about Chinese-speaking students in California, and that they had to have the same access to curriculum regardless of their language background. And so what we can see is that there's a history of cases being brought in order to ensure that students have access to curriculum regardless of their language background. And bilingual education was a way to accomplish that. And so within the original Bilingual Education Act, it would later get added into the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, which we now know as ESSA. The original version of it was ESEA. And that was when we actually see federal funds being provided for speakers for languages other than English, all the way back in 1968. So the origins of these kind of federally date back to that era of the civil rights movement. Locally in New York City, leaders from the Aspira organization, which was a group of Puerto Rican immigrants here within New York, advocated throughout the 60s and 70s. And it was in 1972 that the New York City Board of Education made an agreement with Aspira that really recognized the right of students with limited English proficiency and their right to a bilingual education. This was initially for Spanish-speaking students, but with short time, it expanded to all language groups. And so here in New York, we've had this commitment since 1972 to really honor students' heritage language and support them in that. But even though that commitment was made in 1972, we saw a variety of pressures throughout the next preceding decades that families had to continue to lobby for this right. And so here we see protests from 1976 in terms of families, although saying that there was a recognized right to bilingual bicultural education, families still don't feel like they have equal access to it. We see in 1963 in Dade, Florida, was the first formally recognized bilingual education school. In New York City, our first bilingual education opened in the South Bronx at PS 25 in 1968. And then so I guess jumping ahead then from that time to 1984, we see that we still continue to have limited access to our bilingual education programs. But where students have been able to participate in bilingual education programs, we see that they're doing far better academically. Louis Reyes, who was at the time the board representative for Manhattan and now is on the New York State Board of Regents, thought that the current bilingual programs did not necessarily align to all the programmatic goals, including biliteracy. And so I'm going to jump ahead for time real quick. And so we see kind of the new recognition here locally within New York State comes within Commissioner's Regulation 154. And in 2014, Commissioner's Regulation 154 was revised that really outlined more specific requirements for what components need to exist within a high-quality bilingual education program to address those concerns from the programs that existed prior and the quality of those programs. And so from 2014 on, we now have a pretty explicit set of guidance around content and language allocation for our bilingual programs. And let's talk about what those look like. So research has established over and over again that bilingual education for English language learners in the long run results in students being able to outperform other English language learners that participate in English only programs. This is for all of our research hawks out there, a great list of authors that have done research on this topic. We also see that there are social emotional benefits and economic benefits for students that participate in bilingual education because of their opportunities to practice and extend some of the cultural aspects related to their identity within that linguistic environment. Economically, we know that bilingualism is also an asset as people are looking for work. The opportunity to speak in other languages is a monetary asset also, and so really leads to better outcomes for our students in the career world. So recognizing these rights, the New York State Blueprint for English Language Learner and Multilingual Learner Success advocates and recognizes that bilingualism and biliteracy are assets and that they should be provided to all students in order to help them earn the seal of biliteracy, amazing recognition of the student's ability to both engage in academic content in multiple languages. We also know that we could be able to use our students' home languages, cultural assets, and prior knowledge within our classrooms. And that is also number 7 here from the blueprint. And so I just want to pause on that question really quick and think about districts and schools that recognize bilingualism and biliteracy as assets. We're coming from a wide variety of locations. So it'd be great for you to think on your own, and if you would want to share into the chat. How do you see this quote from the Blueprint for ELLs Success being implemented and in practice in your role? Recognize the cultures and ways of knowing within the culturally responsive and sustaining framework. So as we're practicing New York State's CRSE framework, the recognition of students' prior knowledge and their cultures also becomes a recognized. The New York State statement around knowing that the ways of different languages and ways of knowing have been previously devalued and suppressed, imperiled by years of educational, social, political, and economic neglect from other forms of oppression. It is really a call to ourselves of action in order to support these opportunities for students to engage in content within their home languages. So how that looks within New York State how this looks within New York City is that students are encouraged to participate in multiple program pathways towards the New York State Seal of Biliteracy. There are foreign language, now known as world language programs, that could begin as early as pre-K. We also have pre-K dual language programs. These programs are open to English language learners and also non-English language learners. We talked about the broad umbrella group of multilingual learners. Begin 3 pathways towards multilingualism. World languages programs provide all opportunities for students, and they're working on developing more quickly for English language learners to develop more conceptual skills in their home language while they're also developing their English proficiency. So here in New York City, we can see that the transitional bilingual education programs and dual language programs are about split across the city of how many we have. We have slightly more transitional bilingual education programs. Also for us to note, within those settings, either program might have additional services for special education. And so there are additional bilingual special education programs that make up about 27% of our bilingual programs, also provide additional supports for students with disabilities. And so to speak to explicitly how the rights of students are enshrined within state policy, Commissioner's Regulation 154 has the requirement that any English as a new language programs must be provided to English language learners that are not served in a bilingual education program. So students who are participating in a bilingual education program get that additional support within the context of bilingual education. But families do have the opportunity to express their preference for English as a new language only services, and so they would receive those supports outside of the bilingual education program. Therefore, we know all English language learners are receiving those supports. And so I just want to bring us back then to where are our roles and our opportunities in this within our system. So it'd be great if you want to take a moment and either in a blank document, you can just open up Microsoft Word on your computer. If you're on your phone, you can open up a quick little note app and just reflect for a second on what can you do in your current role that might be able to support the bilingualism or the biliteracy of students. Or your example of what you would want to do. And I would love it. We'll see this chat fill up with all these great opportunities, and you might never know how you might inspire someone else to help support them. And so feel free to add into the chat. If you don't feel comfortable sharing with this group, that's totally acceptable. There's a lot of people here we don't know. But I would maybe request for you to share what you wrote down with a colleague, close friend, or a family member after today's session, just so that we can make that commitment to each other. 2022, there were 538 bilingual education programs in the city in 12 different languages. And so we have this great opportunity that there are these existing bilingual education programs. But in the chat, people have brought up, how are there opportunities to start new programs? How can we support more students' access? So we have a challenge where citywide, we were able to open 32 new programs last school year, but at that same time, 32 bilingual programs closed. So there is a challenge that we all have to take together as a community to really look at how we can help support bilingual program sustainability. Because although we're opening new programs, we're seeing the same rate of number of programs close. And so I think that's our first challenge for all of us to take on. And would love in the questions Padlet, if you have also ideas about how we could support this, feel free to add those there. I think the second half of this challenge is about access. People brought up where are there opportunities for students to join these programs? We discussed that families have the opportunity to opt for English as a new language only, and the majority of our families do ask for English as a new language programs. So only 16% of our English language learners are currently being served in the bilingual education program. And so although we have this research that shows academically, social emotionally, and even eventually in the career readiness world that bilingual education better prepares our English language learner students, there's still a lot of belief within the communities that students need to be able to learn English as quickly as possible, or maybe families are not valuing their home language, or at least not valuing biliteracy, the idea that students need to develop strong academic rigor within that home language. And so I think our first challenge that we're going to take on together are about the high number of programs that close. The second challenge that I would love for us to all take on together is to think about our English language learner population and how we can help families make the best decision that's for the specific families, and knowing, maybe dispelling some misconceptions that they do exist around what it means to really be biliterate and learning and content in those home language groups. Take on. And so with that, we're going to pivot to questions in a second. I'm going to start to review what was prioritized with the likes, but wanted to share in the chat. Joel can help me in a second and share the SharePoint link. The Division of Multilingual Learners has a variety of resources around bilingual education hosted on our SharePoint site. And for questions, you can always reach out to dml@schools.nyc.gov. A quick secret is that there are only 2 people that are checking that email inbox, and they're me and my colleague Elizabeth, who sits next to me. So you can email that email inbox, and you're really just emailing me. But if you really want to email me directly for that personal touch, also feel free to use my email, which is down below. A secret is that I don't really know how to check my voicemail. So you can call that phone number, but if I'm not at my desk, I have 14 voicemails that I don't know how to check on the school CEP. And there are multiple components of that school CEP. The CEP stands for Comprehensive Education Plan. So annually, schools work on their comprehensive education plans. And within the comprehensive education plan, one, there have to be, for schools with a large number of English language learners, there have to be academic goals specific for English language learners. And all schools, regardless of whether or not they have English language learners or not, write a thing called the language allocation plan. And within that language allocation plan, there are opportunities to design bilingual education programs and world language programs. So if you are a school-based staff and you have not read your school's CP or language allocation plan, I would encourage you to go and look at that and find out in your school community who is a part of that school leadership team, and maybe they need some help and they're open to some people helping working on that language allocation policy section. As a profile right there is like a quick way to distinguish between the differences between these 2 programs. Why there is a difference between those 2 programs and the student population has to do with the program goal. In a dual language program, the goal is for all students to be developing bilingualism, that they are fluent in both languages. They're developing biliteracy, that they can engage in academic content in both languages. And they're working on biculturalism. They're exchanging different cultural ideas between maybe English proficient and English language learners. Now, that doesn't mean that the students all speak English at home, right? We're named English proficient students. So you could imagine that a dual language program might have some students that are English language learners and some students who have a home language of English. That's like a 2-way dual language model. There also could be a 1-way dual language model where maybe all students have a home language of Spanish, but some of them are English proficient and some of them are still ELLs. It's not about that the students' home languages are different, but it's about that some are English language learners and some are English proficient. So that was dual language. In contrast, a transitional bilingual education program is exclusively for English language learners. And the reason why is because in a transitional bilingual education program, we're developing students' home language proficiency, we're developing students' English proficiency, I should say, while engaging in content in the home language. So they're really kind of working to add English proficiency to their skill set. And so maybe you would imagine a recently arrived student will receive the majority of their instruction in their home language while getting some instruction in English. And then as they develop that proficiency, that allocation of language will shift to be more and more English throughout the student's academic career.